Every war in history has people that are for it and against it. One war in particular in American history that had a strong resistance from the American people was the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War took place entirely overseas, and many people believe that America should not concern themselves with this issue. The disagreement began between the North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Each side wanted full control of the whole country, and neither would give in or compromise because they had very different political views. North Vietnam was a strongly communist country, while the South was a republic. The North received a lot of help from other countries who wanted communism to spread, like China and Russia. The South was backed by America, the Philippines, and other anti-communist countries. America's reasoning behind jumping into South Vietnam was that they did not want communism to spread to any other country. America was in the middle of the Cold War with Russia, and allowing Russia to help communism enter all of Vietnam was not what they wanted. America saw communism as a threat to their government and world power, so they wanted to put a stop to it any way they could. America's involvement increased each year as the war became bigger. The North fought mainly through guerrilla warfare, while America and the South relied on airstrikes. North Vietnam was bombed more than any other country in the world. But despite that, the North never ceased to fight back. Their leader, Ho Chi Minh, believed that even if 10 of his men died for every one of the opponents, he would still fight because he strongly believed his cause was right. When the war was not advancing very far, many people began to listen to the protesters and consider removing American troops. By August 1973, President Nixon ordered the last of the troops left in Vietnam to be removed. This was good news to many people across America. There had been many casualties in the war, and many people were glad to have that war end. Even today, there are still many differing opinions on whether or not America should have been involved in this war.
Many viewed the Vietnam War and United States intervention in it as a good thing, stopping communism and spreading democracy around the world. However, a large majority of Americans did not feel the same way. Many thought that the United States should not be involved in the war at all. Student groups, hippies, even mothers of soldiers led large protests all around the country, voicing their opinions about U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Each of these groups had their own reasons for being against the war, but no matter the reason, no one was shy about telling everyone how they felt about the war in Vietnam. One of the reasons that many protested the war in Vietnam was because of the way the media portrayed the acts of war against the Vietnamese people and the devastation in general in Southeast Asia. Many people who were resisting the war were student associations, but another majority consisted of large groups of hippies. Hippies believed in love and peace rather than hate and war, so when they saw what the United States Armed Forces were doing to the people of Vietnam, they did not approve and wanted to put a stop to it so there could be peace all around the world. Another reason that fueled many protests was the moral, legal, and practical arguments that many had against the United States intervention in the war. Many American students in college opposed the war for this reason. They believed that the war was immoral, and they also believed that the United States had imperialistic plans for Vietnam. Others believed that the war in Vietnam was a civil war and that America had no right to intervene because it was the job of the Vietnamese people to determine what would happen to their country. However, of all the reasons, one of the biggest reasons that many were opposed to the war was the draft. The majority of the people who were opposed to the draft were students who were within the ages that were eligible to be drafted. Out of all the American troops in Vietnam, approximately 1/3 of them were selected through the draft. All men who were at the age of 18 could be sent a letter that instructed them to report to their local recruitment station, where they would be examined and then deemed either fit to fight or not able to serve, based on their physical qualities. There were a few reasons that one could be exempt from his duty to serve. For example, if he was in college or was needed at home to help his family get on financially, he could be exempt. But for the majority of young men, this was not the case, and they were sent off to Vietnam to fight for their country. Though these are just a few, there are many more reasons why anti-war protests were held all over the country. Whether they were led by hippies, students, or even mothers, each group was very adamant about their position against United States involvement in Vietnam.
A majority of American citizens were upset over the war in Vietnam, as the draft reached many. Some families were even divided in their views. On May 2, 1964, the first major public student demonstration and protest against the war in Vietnam took place. It happened in New York City, with over 1,000 students marching through Times Square to the United Nations in protest. Also, more than 700 students and young people marched through San Francisco, in Boston, Madison, Wisconsin, and Seattle. There were simultaneously smaller demonstrations as well. Other demonstrations of protest also took place, such as the burning of draft cards, similar to when Gandhi burned the passes in India. David Miller was the first to publicly burn his draft card in New York City. The protest was staged and run by the student-run National Coordinating Committee to End the War. Thousands gathered in protest, the majority of which were young adults, after a recent law was passed prohibiting anyone to burn draft cards. The brave men that were first to burn their draft cards were brutally hosed down. Even David Miller was arrested and sentenced to 2 years' prison. The prohibiting of the burning of draft cards was taken to court when the United States versus O'Brien. O'Brien argued that it was a violation of the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, to be criminally charged for burning a draft card. However, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the United States.
Anti-war protests sparked in 1965 after the intensity of the bombs the U.S. was releasing on North Vietnam increased. Many peace activists and left-wing intellectuals had already been protesting against the U.S.'s involvement in the war, but this change in events sparked a national movement. Critics began questioning the government's assertion it was using to fight a democratic war to liberate South Vietnam from communist forces. The Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, organized teach-ins, actively expressing opposition against the war on college campuses. Many students were already involved in the civil rights and women's liberation movements. On October 21, 1967, the largest demonstration thus far in the war, involving 100,000 protesters, gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in the Pentagon, resulting in hundreds being arrested. Norman Mailer wrote in his book The Armies of the Night that, if the Republic was now managing to convert the citizenry to a plastic mass ready to be attached to any manipulative gung-ho, the author was ready to cast much of the blame for such success into the unnourished lap, the over-psychologicalized loins of the liberal academic intellectia. They were, of course, politically opposed to the present programs and movements of the Republican Asian foreign policy, but this political difference seemed no more than a quarrel among engineers. Liberal academics had no root of real war with technology land itself. No, in all likelihood, they were the natural managers of that future era, conditioned vault where the last of human life would still exist. The anti-war movement spread even more when Martin Luther King Jr. openly opposed all war movements on moral grounds, calling out the disproportionate number of African American casualties in relation to all soldiers who were killed in the war.
Let's pause for a moment to focus on this man, Martin Luther King Jr. Through his words, this man was one of the most influential people in all of history. On April 4th of 1967 at Riverside Church in New York City, King delivered one of his many powerful speeches. This time, he talked about his stance regarding the Vietnam War. Listen for yourself to hear what he has to say, and keep in mind that he has 3,000 eager listeners staring up at him, ready to get to work.
Tonight, however, I wish not to speak with Hanoi and the National Liberation Front, but rather to my fellow Americans. That is, at the outset, a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, new beginnings. Then came the build-up in Vietnam. And I watched this program broken and eviscerated as if it was some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such.
Clearly, King had a tremendous impact on potential protesters with speeches like that. there were still other events that encouraged Americans to oppose the war as well. Take, for example, in 1968, 1 year after King delivered his Vietnam speech, when the Tet Offensive was launched.
After the launch of the Tet Offensive by North Vietnamese Communist troops in January 1968, members of the organization Vietnam Veterans Against the War joined the protests. They threw away their war medals on television to support the movement. Boxer Muhammad Ali was also in adamant opposition of the war, declaring himself a conscientious objector that resulted in a 3-year ban from boxing. Members of the hippie movement and popular artists of that time became involved as well. Artists during the 60s and 70s used their careers to increase the prominence of war opposition in the media. Ronald Haberle, Peter Saul, and Nancy Sparrow were among a group of visual artists who used their works to show Americans who they believed were responsible for the violence.